Hello everyone. The book that I've just started reading is called Testament to Youth and it's by Vera Brittain. So it's an autobiography and you can see I'm reading it on my phone because I have my Kindle app on my phone. So I'm recording this off my laptop. So first of all I want to read you the preface, which is written by Vera Brittain's daughter, and it explains a little bit about the book. It is now 60 years since the First World War ended, and few are still alive who survived that fearful experience at first hand. The war should now be part of history. The weapons, the uniforms, the static horror of battles fought in trenches are all obsolete now. Yet the First World War refuses to fade away. It has marked all of us who were in any way associated with it, even at one generation's remove through our parents. The books, the poetry, the artefacts of those 4.5 years still speak to young men and women who were not even born when the Second World War ended. Why are we so haunted? I think it is because of the terrible irony of the war, the idealism and high-mindedness that led boys and men in their hundreds of thousands to volunteer to fight and often to die, the obscenity of the square miles of mud, barbed wire, broken trees and shattered bodies into which they were flung, battalion after battalion, and the total imbalance between the causes for which the war was fought on both sides, as against the scale of the human sacrifice. As Wilfred Owen put it in The Send-Off, shall they return to beatings of great bells in wild trainloads? A few, too few for drums and yells. There is another reason too. The First World War was the culmination of personal war. Men saw the other human being they had killed, visibly dead. Men fought with bayonets, with knives, or even their bare hands. The guns themselves were on the battlefields, thick with smoke, the gunners sweaty and mud-bound. War had not yet become a pitting of scientist against scientist or technologist against technologist. Death was not, on either side, elimination through pressing a button, but something seen and experienced personally, bloody, pathetic and foul. My own picture of the war was gleaned from my mother. Her life, like that of so many of her contemporaries who were actually in the fighting or dealing with its consequences, was shaped by it and shadowed by it. It was hard for her to laugh unconstrainedly. At the back of her mind the row upon row of wooden crosses were planted too deeply. Through her I learned how much courage it took to live on in service to the world when all those loved best were gone. Her fiancé first, her best friend, her beloved only brother. The only salvation was work, particularly the work of patching and repairing those who were still alive. After the war the work went on, writing, campaigning, organising against war. My mother became a lifelong pacifist. I still remember her in her 70s determinedly sitting in a CND demonstration and being gently removed by the police. Testament of Youth is, I think, the undisputed classic book about the First World War written by a woman, and indeed a woman whose childhood had been a very sheltered one. It is an autobiography and also an elegy for a generation. For many men and women it described movingly how they themselves felt. Time and again, in small Welsh towns and in big northern cities, someone has come up to me after a meeting to ask if my mother was indeed the author of Testament of Youth, and to say how much it meant to them. It is a precious sort of immortality. I hope now that a new generation, more distant from the First World War, will discover the anguish and pain in the lives of those young people 60 years ago, and, in discovering, will understand. Shirley Williams, August 1977. So I'm just flicking forward to part 1. Long ago there lived a rich merchant who, besides possessing more treasures than any king in the world, had in his great hall 3 chairs, one of silver, one of gold, and one of diamonds. But his greatest treasure of all was his only daughter, who was called Catherine. One day Catherine was sitting in her own room, when suddenly the door flew open, and in came a tall and beautiful woman, holding in her hands a little wheel. "Catherine," she said, going up to the girl, which would you rather have, a happy youth or a happy old age?" Catherine was so taken by surprise that she did not know what to answer, and the lady repeated again, "Which would you rather have, a happy youth or a happy old age?" Then Catherine thought to herself, "If I say a happy youth, then I shall have to suffer all the rest of my life. No, I will bear trouble now and have something better to look forward to." So she looked up and said, "Give me a happy old age." "So be it," said the lady, and turning her wheel as she spoke, vanishing the next moment as suddenly as she had come. Now this beautiful lady was the destiny of poor Catherine. Forward from Newcastle. The War Generation, AVE. In cities and in hamlets we were born, and little towns behind the van of time. A closing era mocked our guileless dawn with jingles of a military rhyme. But in that song we heard no warning chime, nor visualized in hours benign and sweet the threatening woe that our adventurous feet would starkly meet. Thus we began amid the echoes blown across our childhood from an earlier war, too dim, too soon forgotten to dethrone those dreams of happiness we thought secure, while imminent and fierce outside the door, watching a generation grow to flower, the fate that held our youth within its power waited its hour. Vera Brittain, 1932. Chapter 1. When the Great War broke out, it came to me not as a superlative tragedy, but as an interruption of the most exasperating kind to my personal plans. To explain the reason for this egotistical view of history's greatest disaster, it is necessary to go back a little. To go back, though only for a moment, as far as the decadent 90s, in which I opened my eyes upon the none too promising day. I have indeed the honour of sharing with Robert Graves the subject of my earliest recollection, which is that of watching, as a tiny child, the flags flying in the streets of Macclesfield for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Fortunately, there is no need to emulate my contemporaries' goodbye to all that in travelling still further back into the ponderous Victorianism of the 19th century, for no set of ancestors could have been less conspicuous or more robustly lowbrow than mine. Although I was born in the Mauve decade, the heyday of the Yellow Book and the Green Carnation, I would confidently bet that none of my relatives had ever heard of Max Beerbohm or Audrey Beardsley, and if indeed the name of Oscar Wilde awakened any response in their minds, it was not admiration of his works, but disapproval of his morals. My father's family came from Staffordshire. The first place names bound up with my childhood memories are those of the Five Towns and their surrounding villages: Stoke, Hanley, Burnslem, Newcastle, Longport, Trentham, Barlaston and Stone. And I still remember seeing, at a very early age, alarming glimpses through a train window of the pot bank furnaces flaming angrily against a black winter sky. At an old house in Barlaston, then as now associated with the large and dominant Wedgwood family, my father and most of his 11 brothers and sisters were born. The records of my more distant predecessors are few, but they appear to have been composed of that mixture of local businessmen and country gentlemen of independent means, which is not uncommon in the Midland counties. They had lived in the neighbourhood of the pottery towns for several generations, and estimated themselves somewhat highly in consequence, though there is no evidence that any of them did anything of more than local importance. The only ancestor of whom our scanty family documents record any achievement is a certain Richard Brittain, who was mayor of Newcastle under Lyme in 1741. The others were mostly small bankers, land agents and manufacturers on a family scale. In 1855, when Victorian prosperity was flourishing on the pinnacle represented by the Great Exhibition of 1851, my great-grandfather gave up his work at a private bank in Newcastle and purchased a little paper mill in the potteries from the Huguenot family of paper machine inventors. Towards the end of the century, his growing firm, in which my father was now a junior partner, acquired another small mill in the neighbourhood of Leek. From this business, of which in 1889 the weekly wages bill was under £12, the greater part of the family income has since been derived. My father was one of the 4 chief directors until his retirement during the war, and even I am a capitalist to the extent of owning a few shares. Out of my great-grandfather's experiment has now grown a large and flourishing concern which produces some exquisite fine papers from the most up-to-date plant and machinery, though the outlook of its directors, honourable and efficient businessmen like the shrewd North Country manufacturers in a Phyllis Bentley novel, is still tinged with the benevolent commercial feudalism of the later 19th century. The collective psychology of the neighbourhood in my childhood may be deduced from a saying once proverbial in Staffordshire: "Let us go to Leek out of the noise." In those days my father, who even now regards my membership of the Labour Party as a strange highbrow foible, used often to boast to chance visitors that his firm had never had a trade union man on the place. When my father, who was the best looking and most reasonable of a large and somewhat obstinate family, married my mother in 1891, his relatives disapproved, since she was without money or pedigree, and had nothing but her shy and wistful prettiness to recommend her. Instead of being the prospective heiress of county rank, which my prospering grandparents doubtless thought appropriate for their eldest son, she was merely the second of 4 daughters of a struggling musician, who had come from Wales to take the post of organist at a church in Stoke-on-Trent. Since the remuneration brought in by this appointment was quite insufficient for the support of a wife and 6 growing children, he gave music and singing lessons, which paid a little, and composed songs and organ voluntaries, which did not pay at all. As a young man, my father fancied his voice, and so took a few singing lessons from the kindly organist. Thus he met my mother, then a graceful and exceptionally gentle girl of 21, dominated by her more positive mother and sisters. After they were married, rather quickly and quietly at Southport, owing to the sudden premature death of my charming but impecunious grandfather, my father's family showed no disposition beyond a formal visit on the part of his mother to hers, to see any more of these modest in-laws, and for some years the 2 families continued to live within a few miles of each other, but hardly ever to meet.